Spoiler warning. This is your spoiler warning for this episode. In this episode, Lynn Zubernis and I dive deep into all things Supernatural finale. We get into the nitty-gritty details of the last 3 episodes, but also discuss the last season as a whole. Considering how the whole conversation plays out, there's no way for me to provide specific time codes for spoilers. So, this is your general all-purpose warning. Now, on to the conversation. All right, well, I figure the easiest way to kick things off is to do some quick introductions. So, Lynn, do you want to go ahead and start with who you are and why you care about Supernatural?
Which is an understatement. I really do care about Supernatural. Yes, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I'm a clinical psychologist and a professor at Westchester University. One of my main research areas over the past, 20 years now has been fandom and the psychology of being a fan. And my favorite television show of all time is Supernatural. So clearly, I had to combine those two things. So I have written 7 books on fandom, most of them focusing on Supernatural, and 2 of them with the cast of Supernatural.
Yeah, and just to kind of remind listeners, because I included this in season 1, but you've been a fan since like season 2, season 3 is when you really got hooked, right?
I started watching in season 1. I got hooked in the beginning of season 2. So I would
That's
say I have been a very passionate fan since the beginning of season 2.
Yeah. And all my intro, I mean, I hope listeners know who I am. But I guess what I want to caveat how our kind of different perspectives might be on this is that I started watching I started watching Supernatural after I watched a YouTube video talking about the end of the series and how it made online spaces, especially like Tumblr, explode. And I thought, that sounds interesting. It's October. I could watch a spooky monster killing show. And I inhaled all 15 seasons in, I want to say 4 months. I started to slow down towards the end because I was trying to savor that last season. So I had a very different experience. Like, what was your experience going into and I'm going to call the season finale kind of the last 3 episodes, I think is the best way to talk about the ending. So what were your thoughts and feelings going into those last 3 episodes?
Mostly a lot of anticipatory grief. I mean, this had, at the time that the show was ending, it had been a huge part of my life, both my personal life, just in loving the show and going to conventions and being a fan, but also my professional life, because at that point, had written, 6 books on the show, and I had a new one that was about to come out to sort of coincide with the ending, right before the ending. And so this was really difficult for me. I had a lot of trepidation about how am I going to handle this? How much is this loss going to impact me? I'm so used to having this show as a big part of my personal and professional life. So I had a lot of anticipatory grief and a lot of anxiety about the ending.
Yeah, I feel like, especially because they announced that it would be the final season before it really kicked off, it brought in a lot of like anticipation about how would this end, and also probably brought back a lot of fans who had maybe dropped off, a few seasons ago who wanted to see what that final wrap up was going to look like.
It did. It definitely did. I know a lot of people personally who had sort of, wandered away from the show seasons 12, 13, around in there. And then when they heard that it was ending, quickly went back and caught up and maybe watched, the last season live again to wrap it up.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure to have on a cast and crew and writers, and knowing that you got to remind everybody who maybe dropped off early on, like, this is who this character is. Like, just a reminder, this is, what's going on.
Yeah, I remember at Comic-Con, the last Comic-Con when the show was airing, I did the press roundtables, and the showrunners and the writers were extremely nervous. I remember sitting at the table with Andrew Dabb and him kind of joking, like, preemptively, well, the ending is one that nobody's going to like, and we're prepared for that, ha ha, nobody's going to like it. And it was clearly just sort of his way of trying to break away from being so anxious about trying to please everyone and make an ending that would somehow magically make every faction of the fandom be like, oh great, that was great, we love that ending, which of course he knew was never going to happen. So it was interesting to me, he was already psychologically trying to prepare himself for the fact that not everybody was going to like the ending.
Yeah, I mean, with such a large like juggernaut of a show, there's already factions. They're pretty well established, and like everybody's waiting to be, quote unquote, proved right with the ending, whatever that might mean, and that could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, no, there was, I mean, it was in online enclaves, the year, the final season leading up to the show ending was like conspiracy theories from every corner, and people saying, "Oh, I got a leaked script," or "I talked to this person or that person and I know what's going to happen." And I was in the midst of, still having my researcher hat on and researching all of this, and sometimes the things that different groups would be saying were literally mutually exclusive. Group one would be saying, "Oh, I have a leaked script and it says X," and group two would be saying, "Oh, I have a leaked script and it says Y," and they were completely antithetical. So it was a crazy time in fandom leading up to the ending.
And what's so ridiculous is I read this really interesting book on kind of fandom research from a more journalist point of view. And the journalist was talking about how difficult it is to find old comments and memes and things from Tumblr because it's this weird kind of organic bubbling up of like the internet's id in some ways. And I'd be curious to try to like pull all the old conspiracy theories that people had across the seasons and how wild they got, because that was an experience I did not have at all. I literally knew what the ending was going to be going into it, which is kind of psychopathic behavior. I totally understand.
I love the fact that our experience was so diametrically opposite on the show. Like it's really
Yeah.
interesting just to see the two of us and our reaction to everything about the show, because we couldn't have come at it from more different time-wise perspectives.
Yeah, I was definitely already, yeah, hearing entrenched opinions and knew the big plot point giveaways and was like, well, I'm curious to see how we get there. There's no anticipatory of what's going to happen so much as how it's going to happen for me.
In some ways, you spared yourself a lot of angst, because there was a lot of angst about what might be happening. I was a teeny tiny bit semi spoiled from picking up on things from meet and greets and things like that. So I kind of had an idea pretty much of what was going to happen. So I wasn't not, I didn't know 100%, but I also didn't go into it completely unprepared, which I think was helpful for me.
Yeah. Yeah, you had a few broader strokes.
Yeah, I had a few
Uh,
hints here and there.
I will say, even knowing what the ending was, like I think at the first time I watched it, I was home alone. My husband was out doing something and he came home and I'm curled up on the couch, just like full on crying. And he's like, "Really? You knew what was gonna happen?" I was like, "But it's so sad."
Some things you just can't prepare yourself for, I guess. I mean, I also was, expecting that to happen in some way, shape, or form, but I was watching by myself. I kicked everyone out of the house because I knew that I wanted to be by myself to watch so I could sob freely. But I had friends on a Zoom call, and I just remember all of us putting our faces up to the Zoom and just everybody having these horrific, tears all over, puffy face, red eyes. It was Somebody should have taken a screenshot because it would have been pretty incredible.
Yeah. Well, okay. We've kind of talked generally. I have two questions for you. And I guess the first one is overall how you felt about the ending. And then I want to break down the last three episodes, how you felt about each of them. Because I think we have different opinions, which I am excited to get into.
Yeah, yeah, and I wonder how much of our different opinions are probably due to several things, but one of them I think is probably the way we encountered the show and what our course of watching it was. I love the finale. it's difficult sometimes for me to explain why I loved it because I think it's complicated. My love for it is complicated. I don't love it in woohoo, this is my comfort episode, and I'm talking about the last episode first. So the actual series finale, 1520, I love. But I don't love it in the way of, hey, I like to watch it every Friday night while I have a beer because it's my way of kicking back and it's a feel good, relaxing thing. I have hardly rewatched it at all because the barn scene, spoiler alert, is really difficult to watch. So I don't love it in the sense of la la la, this is something I want to watch again and again and again, but I love it because it feels to me like the right ending of the show. For 20, not 20 years, for 15 years of watching the show, I never expected the ending to be anything but tragic because watching it from the beginning, especially the early seasons, which were quite dark, darker than it got as it went through the seasons, it was almost inconceivable to think the ending would be anything but. And over the years, when people talked about the ending, 9 times out of 10, or maybe 99 times out of 100, the actors, the writers, the showrunners, whenever anybody speculated or hypothesized about the ending, it was always a tragic ending. It was often both of the brothers were going to die. I think that's what most of us assumed throughout the show who've been watching from the beginning, that that's what was going to happen. So I certainly had that expectation and kind of felt prepared. But I loved the way they did it. It was much more meaningful than I was expecting. I didn't want Dean to die. I'm pretty sure there's not a single fan anywhere that wanted Dean to die. He's a character that many of us really relate to and really love. So of course you don't want to see that fictional character die. But I do think it's appropriate that he died and it made sense. And I love that he went out doing the thing that he loved doing. He was saving people, hunting things. He didn't give up. He died with his boots on. And that was how he wanted to go, which is something that Jensen's kind of reiterated my thoughts about it in saying that, this is how Dean would want to go, dying on an ordinary hunt, which really emphasizes just how dangerous their lives were forever, because that could have happened at any time. It wasn't some big dramatic world-ending thing. It was an ordinary hunt because that was the danger they faced every single day. And Dean really broke the cycle. Well, Sam and Dean together broke the cycle of making deals and refusing to go on without the other one. They did that. At the end, they did the thing that the show was not known for. So that was sort of the most striking character evolution, that and Dean actually being able to say what he needed to say to Sam and feel like, okay, I had my chance. I got to say what I wanted to say, and I don't want to go. This is not me giving up in any way, shape, or form. So it was tragic, but it was also beautiful because that evolution was there.
Yeah, I guess so I did not like the final episode, but I want to caveat with that with a few things. Like, one, we're not really going to talk about the impacts of COVID in this conversation. I'm going to do a whole episode about how COVID really forced some rewrites and some structural changes that, it's amazing they were able to pull off an ending at all when, I don't know if everyone remembers this, but I remember being totally shut down, wearing a mask to walk my dog in my neighborhood, even though I was 20 feet away from other people, feeling really scared and uncertain. Like, it's amazing that we got to have an ending at all. But, and I do actually love the barn scene. I think that both actors totally brought their A game. I like the concept of Dean dying on his feet. I understand what that means for the character. It didn't make sense to me after 18 and 19, I guess, is my problem. Is like, 20 felt really disconnected from the previous two episodes. Like, it kind of like the first 20 minutes almost feels like the actors and writers doing a fan fiction of like, imagine if like everything worked out. Like, now they're going to a pie festival. And I liked that. It kind of felt self-indulgent in a way that I enjoyed, but it didn't the pieces didn't string together in a full story that made sense to me. Like it felt really disconnected and kind of disjointed. And it was, and like, I don't even want to talk about the wig. I think that that's like a silly complaint. Once again, like, or blurry wife. Everybody complains about Sam's blurry wife. And I was like, I think it's pretty clear that's supposed to be Eileen. I think, like, sorry they couldn't get every actor back up there because you had to, quarantine for 2 weeks and get everything spaced out. Like, I give them those, but I don't know. I didn't like it. It did feel to me like it was disjointed from everything else that had happened. I understand the like trying to push back against, oh, they've like defeated cosmic forces and like it's a simple hunt that takes them out. But I kind of felt like the episode about like Hunter's luck earlier in the season kind of addressed that. And I don't know. I didn't like the last episode. I liked the conclusion, but not the last episode.
Yeah. I think that the first part of it, by the way, I don't think blurry wife is Eileen. We don't agree on anything, which I love so much. I love that we're friends and we don't agree on anything, because when does that ever happen in the supernatural fandom? Like, it never literally happens. We are such rule breakers, I'm telling you. I think the last episode, I think, is a little rushed in the beginning. I love the beginning, sort of the, like a domestic routine, kind of some sort of normalcy for Sam and Dean, which isn't normal, but normalcy for Sam and Dean, and some happiness. But it's kind of rushed. I kind of wish that they had, and I get that they had to, it was the last episode, they had a lot to cram in there. But it goes so fast that it kind of seems odd. It's sort of like a music video without music, kind of a montage kind of thing. And I remember at the time thinking, this is odd. What is this? Is this like, are we gonna have music with this? Is this a music video? So I think that is some of the disjointedness. It's also if you like graft the episode, it's a really interesting but unusual episode in that it starts out with this sort of happy, silliness, pie festival, kick the dryer because you've been there long enough to know when you have to kick it, blah, blah, blah. Then it goes into the most tragic moment you could ever imagine. And yes, I agree, the actors absolutely slayed it. I mean, it's incredible, but you're devastated. And then it pulls up at the end to be also what was intended as a moment of sort of pure happiness, reunion, heaven, broke the cycle, back together again, everything's great. So in one little 42-minute episode, that's a lot of progression. And I think it's a little dizzying to watch it.
Yeah, it's almost like they needed like a 2-hour finale or something. Because the pacing in the last episode feels super off. Like the pacing in 18 and 19 feels great. 18 is like this like impending doom, like everything, the walls are closing in. Like not only are the hunters from Apocalypse World disappearing, like when Donna disappears, you're like, oh my God, like everyone's going. Like it leads up to this really strong finale. And then 19, I love that breaking of the cycle with the rejection, like the final rejection of violence, right? Where Sam and Dean keep getting back up, keep getting pummeled by Chuck, and like are fighting back by standing up to him, but at the very end refuse to kill him and are like, no, man, we're past this. Like we're done. We're out of your story. And that includes like being the ultimate killer. But then 20, I was like, wait, there's too many moods. It feels jumpy. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it is. I think this is entirely me conjecturing, because no one has ever said this to me. I've never asked anyone, in all fairness, but no one has ever said it to me. But I think that, in the last season, for sure, one of the things that really hamstrung the show was that they were aware that the fandom had become very, very fractured. And there were segments of the fandom that wanted and expected very, very different things from the show. And their sort of 3-episode arc ending of the show is a reflection of how, while Dab was struggling with trying to come to terms with, hey, we can't please everyone, everyone is not going to love this, as I heard at Comic-Con, at the same time, they were actually trying to do that. They were trying to provide 3 episodes that would quell the 3 very antithetical factions of the fandom and somehow wouldn't alienate the other 2, as they were doing it. So 18 is for people who either were primarily fans of Cass or were Destiel shippers. 20 is for people who really didn't think they could handle anything but the kind of stereotypical happy ending and had pictured Sam and Dean driving off into the sunset, defeating Chuck, writing their own story, breaking those chains, and then literally driving off into the sunset. That's how many people wanted the show to end. They got that in 19. That's exactly what happened. And 20 was for the people who sort of wanted to follow the story of Sam and Dean to the ending that they had been expecting for perhaps a very long time. And that was the ending that they got. So I really think the tripleness, the perceived tripleness of the end of the show, even if maybe it wasn't explicitly pitched that way, it seems like an attempt to do that, to pacify all three, and there's many more than three, but three
Yeah.
major sort of factions of the fandom. And
I was gonna
you can't really do that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, like with like some of the shipping and some of the factions, like they're almost antithetical to each other, you know?
They're a
Not all of
hundred
them are,
percent.
but
No, but some of them, I mean, most of fandom is not a zero sum game, and people try to make it a zero sum game, and it annoys me because it really, really, really isn't. But there are a couple of things that can't happen at the same time, like rival ships, which is why fandoms get so activated around shipping, because it does a little bit turn into a zero sum game. I mean, come on, if you have enough imagination, even that doesn't have to be a zero sum game, but
I was
whatever.
gonna say there's been a lot of news stories about polyamory recently, but no, that's a joke.
Exactly. No, no, it's not a joke. It's true. Like maybe those are the most well-adjusted people in the fandom who are like, I'm just going to ship everyone with everyone, and then no one can argue with me about anything.
Yeah. Oh, yes, all? No.
Yeah. Yes. All. Please.
Well, and that's what something like I think there's like two unique struggles that Supernatural face. Like, so probably part of the reason I also don't like the last episode 20, which is funny because I watched it all in this massed, really tight amount of time. But I've talked with people who talk about the endings of like the original planned ending for like The Simpsons is supposed to be a callback to the very first episode, like the quote unquote planned ending, if they ever get there, of like it was all like Bart taking, I think it's like something like Bart taking a nap in the car on their way to a ski trip. It's something weird that came in the first episode, but there's been like, I actually have no idea how many seasons of Simpsons there's been. And so I wonder, like, that ending makes sense if you're trying to bookend a book, but for a
Hmm.
television show that now has grown and expanded and contorted and changed shapes, and does a ending that reflects the beginning make sense anymore? And like that's just I think an issue with television in general of like when a series goes on long enough and has grown in all these other ways, it's not like writing a novel where then you get to go back and edit and clean it up so that it's got a tight, coherent storyline. You get a lot of wandering digressions because you're like building the airplane as it's flying. You can't go back and say, can I have a do-over? Like there's no do-overs.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge. I do think the show tried to navigate that, and again, I think it depends on the way you came at it. And I do think people underestimate what a difference it made, the feel of the last episode, whether you had watched 1 week at a time over a span of 15 years and remembered the very beginning from having sort of felt like you lived through it, like your own development paralleling those 15 years. So it became very entwined. And people who came on at some point during the course of the show or after it ended and watched it in a more compressed fashion. I do think that makes a difference. It was very important to me and to a lot of the people I know. Many of my friends in the fandom have also been watching since the very beginning. So these are now people who've been friends for 20 years, unbelievably. We did really want to have that sense of wrapping around. Yes, these are the characters that you fell in love with 15 years ago. They've evolved incredibly, and I think it did show evolution, a lot of evolution. But I felt that that wraparound, reiterating some of the lines from the pilot, that was extremely satisfying to me and to the other people I know who've been watching from the beginning. Probably not everyone who's been watching from the beginning. This is a huge generalization. And I'm sure there's plenty of people who started watching along the way who felt that was satisfying. But I do think you're right. That's a real challenge. Like, how can you both honor the character's evolution and the story's evolution and also bring that sense of bookending wraparound closure? It's hard to negotiate that. I actually feel like they did a pretty decent job of that, but it's tricky.
And I mean, what's interesting is as you're saying that, it's making me think about research about human, so there was a psychology professor at my university where I got my PhD, and he was really interested in the narratives, like self narratives, the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell of our lives, and how that builds a framework for us to understand our challenges, our successes. And so he talks about like how Americans have a tendency to have what's called the redemptive arc, which is
Hmm.
kind of the classic, man in a hole story if you're a journalist, where it's like, I was going along, this horrible, hard thing happened to me and I overcame it. Like Americans love a comeback story. And
Hmm.
it's like the same kind of issue of like you're trying to show growth and development. Like you don't want to be a stereotype of the person that you are, but also if you grow too far, you don't feel true. And it's an interesting line to try to draw. And I mean, gosh, with the intensity of that ending, and not even that it was filmed during COVID, but then people were watching it during COVID, when I think if you were watching it live, like the heightened emotions during that time
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
made it so much more intense.
I totally think that's true. And I actually think, well, first of all, ironically, I think that's going to help the show in the long term if it ever gets a reboot, because there's nothing that makes fans want more of a series than a controversial finale. So I don't think they did that on purpose, but they got this show is the luckiest show ever, right? In terms of timing. It came into being just as the internet and social media were coming into being, so it rode that entire wave. It went out in the middle of a pandemic at a time when people needed comfort shows more than ever, which made the finale so much more controversial and so much more painful than it would have been otherwise. And that has now sustained a passionate fandom for 4 years and counting. The
Well,
show just is lucky.
and then you also have the joys of like streamers buying network television shows and being locked down COVID. And then you get this whole new generation of people like me
Yeah,
who binged because I only had a work from home job, or COVID, I got laid off, whatever. Like
yeah,
you bring in, because I was talking to Rich Spate Jr. about this. He was like, yeah, it's really weird. It's like we keep getting older and somehow the fans are getting younger. And it's just like everybody's watching it on, Netflix or wherever. And I find that really funny and interesting. And it does feel like that gives it a particularly uh gives it aspects that are primed that it could be revived. And I want to talk about revivals and reboots in a bit, but I feel like if I don't talk about this, people will get annoyed. So like I do want to talk about like the shippers, and I'm curious to hear what was going on when it happened live and what the ships looked like. And I guess I'll speak to what I've seen when I started getting online. Like the reason that I started watching was mostly, I say that it spoiled the ending, and it did spoil all three last episodes. But the YouTube video I watched that was talking about how it affected the internet was primarily focused on episode 18. It was primarily focused on despair. And that episode, God, it's so well put together. It's got so many parallels going on. It's got so much activity. I'll go ahead and say I'm a Destiel shipper. Um, like I don't yuck other people's yum, but like that's my personal favorite. And I thought it was really interesting that it starts out with Charlie losing her partner Stevie, and then you get Sam losing Eileen, and then Dean loses Cass. And so it's got these nice parallels. It's got like an incredible confession scene, which I also think they just acted their butts off on. And it like sets you up to really want to know what happens in the next episode. But because they were having to meet all these different interests and these different drives, I felt like, I don't know if you've ever seen Hannah Gadsby's comedy special, Nanette. She does this whole comedy special talking about how comedy is tension and release. You have to have that catharsis and give the audience a chance to break and laugh. Otherwise, it suddenly becomes really tense and uncomfortable. And her whole comedy set in that special is about building and building and building tension, and not like at first she's letting her audience laugh, and then she starts continuously building the tension, and it makes it so much more intense. And I felt like for Destiel shippers, 18 was all tension and no release. They didn't get the catharsis they wanted because that, you're trying to meet so many fandoms. So that was like, that's my point of view, but I'm curious to hear from you what ships looked like at the time and like what you were saying, even just like what you were seeing online or hearing from folks.
The biggest thing I was seeing online at that time was Destiel shippers really being incredibly hopeful about episode 18. There were certainly enough people claiming that, I read the script or I know someone on set, and there were a lot of rumors that it was going to be much more reciprocal than it was. So there was really a ton of hope in the Destiel fandom that after all these years of, perceiving teases and little nods and, subtext essentially, that there was going to be text. And, shipping is really important to people. It's not like a casual thing for many people. It's invested in, your identity is invested in that shipping. So I was really anxious going into 18 because I could see how much people were pinning their hopes on this episode and wanting it to be something that perhaps it wasn't going to be. I wasn't spoiled for the episode, so I didn't know what it was going to be, but I didn't think it was going to be what I was reading people insisting that it was going to be. And it wasn't just people saying, "Oh, I really hope this is what happens between Dean and Cass." It was people who were saying, "Look, I know that this is what's going to happen between Dean and Cass." And I don't know those people. I just see things floating around the internet. I don't know if those people were bad actors who were trying to manipulate people's hopes and get people riled up so that they would have social media cachet. I hate to think like that way about
Yeah,
people,
yeah.
or if they were just really truly misinformed and innocently trying to spread information that they knew would make people happy. I don't know which way it was going, but the outcome of it was that going into 18, there was a huge amount of anticipation. And I was really anxious because I was like, oh God, if these people are really believing this is what's happening and they think they know this, and it's not what happens, they're going to be horribly, horribly let down. And it's not just going to be a little thing like, ha ha, oh, well, it's going to be people really heartbroken about this. So I was worried going into 18. I do think that 18 was really a genuine attempt on the part of Robert Behrens and Misha Collins to give something to the Destiel part of fandom. I think they genuinely wanted the episode to be something that would feel good to the Destiel shippers. They worked on it really hard. I think they really cared about it, but I also think at that point the writers' room was so fractured that different factions of writers at this point wanted completely different things from the show also. They were just as fractured as the fandom, unfortunately. And again, that's why 18, 19, and 20 seem like, wait, is this the same show? Like, did these 3 episodes, are they all the ending of this same show? Because they kind of don't seem like the people who love this one are the same people who are gonna love that one. So I think there was a ton of disappointment after 18, and I don't think that's what the show was expecting. I think
Yeah.
the writer of the show and Misha, for whom that episode was really personally important because it was his last episode and his goodbye to the show, which was partly why he was so emotional. So I think it was important to him, and I think it probably was very hard for him that it didn't go over the way I think they were expecting it to go over. I mean, I think it did for some people. I think there's some people, Destiel shippers, who were really happy to have clarification of Castiel's feelings, but I think there were also a lot of people who wanted that scene to be a lot more reciprocal than it was and were really disappointed.
Yeah, I'm not so me personally, I don't think I didn't feel like I needed it to be reciprocal, but I was frustrated with the dangling thread of in the empty, and then next episode Lucifer gets pulled from the empty, that God could do that, but then like it never gets like there's the single line about like in heaven like Cass help, like that felt cheap, but I didn't think the episode of 18, I didn't feel cheated by what happened in 18. I thought that was like, I was like, no, that's great. It doesn't have like, for me personally, I was like, it doesn't have to be reciprocated as much. I mean, I would like it to be, but it doesn't have to be. I'm more interested in this like final exploration of this character, but it felt weird to then have it be a dropped thread, I guess,
Of
for me.
course. Yeah. I mean, it felt weird. I'm not a Destiel shipper, and it felt weird to me too. I mean, they're like, really 18, 19, and 20. I really do think we're like three different endings meant for three different groups of fandom. So I think also I remember going into 19, there was a lot of hope, obviously, that there would be some follow-up, and maybe, Dean was in shock and we would hear more reciprocation, or maybe not reciprocation, but just see Dean's reaction, and see him grieving, and or
Right.
Cass would get saved from the empty and come back. Like, I don't think anyone really expected that to be Misha's last episode, even though Misha actually had been clear that that was his last episode. So I did know it was his last episode, but even I expected that there would be more follow up. And it did feel jarring that it wasn't. And to put myself in the shoes of a Destiel shipper, I would have been really disappointed about that. And fans were really disappointed about that. If that's the lens through which you watch the show and the characters that are the most important to you, that's a big disappointment.
Yeah, it does feel it can feel like a rug being pulled out from under you in some ways. Like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
I
I,
think it's
I really have empathy.
I really like your view that the three last episodes are three different endings because I think you are totally right. And it's funny when I'm thinking back on the final season, I'm like, oh, in the final season, there's enough episodes that they're trying to braid together all these different pieces. Everybody gets, we get to have different pairs of characters interacting and shining in different ways. It's really fun. But then once you get to the end, it's like, oh, okay, now we just got three separate threads. Like they couldn't knot
That's
them.
Yeah, that's how I've come to look at it. And the more I look at it through that lens, the more clear it seems. And it's interesting because I really don't think it was done intentionally, but because of how they were trying to, essentially please everyone, that was the only way to attempt to do it. They couldn't even fit it all in one episode. There was too much. It was too
Yeah.
much.
Well, okay, so how did I don't like I feel like Wincest is a derogatory term, although I think some people identify with it, but people who shipped more of like the brothers relationships, what was their feeling on the last three episodes or even like the last two, I guess?
It's funny that you say it's a derogatory term because to someone who's been in the fandom since the beginning, it isn't a derogatory term at all. It's just a descriptive term.
Oh,
It's
okay,
interesting.
good.
So I'm going to use it because I don't think it's a derogatory term. Wincest chippers are a completely different group of people because they have never, ever been invested in having any way, shape, or form Wincest in canon. So they've never been invested in, oh, I really need this to happen, or oh, I really need that to happen. So there wasn't that same kind of tension and apprehension leading up to the finale. Most Wincest shippers, well, I shouldn't say that, but I think probably most Wincest shippers are not Destiel shippers. So they didn't have the same anxiety about that ship coming true. And in fact, I'm sure there were plenty of people who were really happy that didn't come because they wanted to focus on the brothers. But there was no sense of, and there never has been for the whole 15 years of the show. Wincest shippers were never invested in what happened in canon. They were always completely happy with how canon was, and then seeing shipping as something that was done in fandom and had nothing to do with the canon. I mean, that's part of the problem with the show itself and the way it went, is that Wincest was the original ship, and the writers kind of got used to, oh, we can make jokes about this, we can tease about this, because obviously everyone knows that Sam and Dean are not going to jump into bed on a show on the CW. Like, it's not Game of Thrones. This is not going to happen. So they felt really safe with teasing about the brothers' relationship, knowing that nobody would take it seriously and nobody would say, okay, come on, you made this joke. So when are we going to see Sam and Dean jump into bed together? That wasn't going to happen. Then when Cass came along and people instantly started to ship Cass and Dean, the writers were like, oh, we're going to do the same thing. Ha ha. We're going to do wink, wink, nudge, nudge, because nobody thinks this could possibly. Oh, wait. And that's where the show took a turn that was forever going to change the way people looked at the show, because they really didn't understand the difference, the vast difference between those two ships and their relationship to canon. So
Well,
I think Wincest shippers were perfectly happy with the ending, but not in any way, shape, or form because it had anything to do with shipping, since it didn't. And I think also the general audience, and especially people who'd watched from the beginning and who were just watching the show as a story about these two brothers and the people they encountered along the way, were also, by and large, pretty happy with the ending.
that's so interesting because it's kind of like the two, like what's, especially for people outside the fandom, like the two main ships, right? Dustiel and Wincest are always pitted against each other, but they're kind of two different understandings of the text.
Which is why I always think, like, why are they pitted against each other?
Yeah,
Like,
they're
there's
kind of
really
fundamentally
no
different.
reason. They're 100% fundamentally different and don't really have to be antithetical. I always get annoyed when fans are attacking other fans for what they ship, because, like, who cares? There's no impact on your ship from this other ship. Just, like, leave it alone. Go ship what you ship.
Right. Read your fan fiction, look at your fan art. It's okay. If you don't
It's
like a
all
thing, you don't have
good.
to look at it. I don't
That's
know.
right.
Like,
It's all good. It's all healthy. It's all fiction. Have fun, people, and stop fighting with each other. That's what I want
I,
to say on the internet every day.
how's that working out? No.
It's not. It's not. I never say it. I'm not stupid. I'm not going to say that.
Well, and I think it's funny because like knowing I also think Supernatural is unique in that it has a really porous boundary between creators and fans in a way that other juggernaut shows did not or have not. I mean,
Hmm.
like there is like fans are not new. You look at like Star Trek fans and like early conventions and zines, and like this is not, the active fandom is not new, but the porousness and the like gameness that writers and showrunners and even actors had to like play along made, I think, gave fans more, felt like they had more creative control than they actually do or should, frankly. I mean, I've had this conversation with some of my friends who are huge TV nerds, love like watching shows, talking about storylines, but do not consider themselves fans. And they like hate the idea of fandom because they don't feel like they should have any ownership over a creative story. They're like, I can like Indiana Jones, I shouldn't, or Star Wars, but I shouldn't be dictating, that The Last Jedi was bad and therefore Rise of Skywalker, they need to do XYZ and I'm gonna, bully an actress online until the plot changes or something like they get really annoyed that fans feel ownership. And it's like Supernatural kind of played in with these lines in really interesting ways because there were conventions throughout the year. I mean, there still are. And writers were willing to, jump online with people and have these conversations and like even kind of do like, ended up putting some textual responses in the shows and making these jokes. Like it's just
Yeah, no, I think Supernatural is the perfect case study for that kind of evolution, because from someone who's been in it from the beginning, the first 5 years or so of the show, fandom was fandom, and you don't talk about fandom. And my first couple of books were controversial because I did talk to the actors and the writers and Kripke about the show and about fandom and about shipping and about all these things that they weren't supposed to know about. There was a real clear, very wide, dark dividing line between the creative side and the fandom side. And again, because Wincest was pretty much the primary ship, there was there was no interest at all in trying to convince the powers that be to incorporate Wincest in the show. So there, I mean, obviously, so there was none of that when people were talking about fandom. It was just more like, hey, this is what we're doing in fandom, and it's staying in fandom, and that's what you're doing on the creative side, and it's staying on the creative side. But once that taboo, once the ships were not just a ship that had a handy dandy taboo around it, now it could be possible for Destiel to be actually in the text and in the canon. So now fans started, trying to pressure people to do that. And not just in Supernatural. I mean, that's happened across the board. That's now a really common thing, partly because there's such a perceived reciprocity, the reciprocal relationship between creators and fans seems like it's much more close now, or it's much more reciprocal. Of course, it's still really 100% one-sided, but it feels more reciprocal with social media and cons.
Yeah, yeah, it feels more reciprocal. And also, I wonder if not as creators, but as networks, there has been more of a push. I mean, you talk about, or I talk about this all the time, of how like it seems like no one's willing to try new. Everybody wants to use old IP. Everybody wants to reboot a show. And like to some degree, we're constantly doing that's, Battlestar Galactica was a reboot,
Mhm.
but people are unwilling to let go of IP. And I almost wonder if like from a network level or a directorate level, there is kind of this desire to give the fans what they want, so they'll buy all our stuff. Like, looking at it from a purely capitalistic point of view, not saying that like, like Kripke or Barron's or anybody like, Andrew Dabb, that's what they were driven by. But I wonder if like that's also part of this like thinning fourth wall in some way.
Yeah, no, yeah, totally. I mean, that's capitalism, right? And
Yeah.
and we've come a long way from the first time I chatted with Kripke. What he knew about fandom was because he went and lurked on the television without pity chat board, like that was what. So he had a million questions for me about fandom, like, oh, tell me about this, tell me about that. Now all you have to do is log on to Tumblr or Instagram or anything, and you can know exactly what fans are thinking. So if you're trying to make money by having the most people consume your media, then obviously you're going to dip into that well.
But that well is also not everyone who's watching the show, which is what I think is interesting. Cause like we're talking about this point of view from fans, and I don't know how I'd find this person, but I think it's a different group of people who liked the show, watched the show, but are not fans, like would never go to a convention, would never read fan fiction. And there's a lot more of those people statistically, and they're not the ones posting on Tumblr or Twitter.
No, no, no. Fandom is by far the tiny minority. The general audience is astronomically bigger for sure. And they don't care about shipping. They don't even if you there are people at conventions who are sometimes these general audience fans actually, they're local. There's a convention in town. They like the show. They go to the convention. And if you talk to them about the things that happen within fandom, they're like, "What? What are you talking about? That's not the show I was watching." I mean, they're just watching a completely different show than people who are watching from within fandom are watching, and especially people who ship something are watching. And those are the people that, the network is truly concerned about, because those are the people who are actually the most who are consuming the show.
Right, right. The highest numbers, you want the most viewers, that's the vast majority. So
Yeah, yeah. Which is why something like Despair is written intentionally vague, because the general audience watching that scene don't even see that as Cass confessing his love. If you say, I've said that to general audience people, and they're like, "What? That's not what are you talking about?" Like it is purposely written vaguely. I don't think anyone within fandom wouldn't have interpreted that way, but the general audience vastly mostly didn't interpret it that way.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. Unfortunately, all my friends know how deep I am into this, so I could never get them to watch it casually and tell me their casual thoughts. But I'm constantly, I need to find more casual attendees at conventions. Just
Yeah, yeah,
like have a few
you have
questions about the biggest fandom things.
Yes, you have to just find the locals, the people who got their GA ticket and came for Saturday or Sunday or something, and then and talk to them, and they're like, "Whoa, who are
Yeah.
you?" Like they'll look at you like a little askance by the time you're done talking to them, but you'll get a lot of information.
I think that'd be really interesting. I think that's my new assignment. Oh man. Well, do you I don't know. Do you think on the creator's end, because now it is 4 years post the ending, do you think the writers, the showrunners, the cast, do you think that they have had changes in their thoughts about the ending? Do you like you don't even have to say what they are. I don't know. I just think it's interesting that there's probably been a lot of development because especially the cast has such regular interactions with the more intense of the fandom. And so probably have a different view than maybe someone who is in the writer's room the final season, but doesn't, hasn't gone to a supernatural convention.
Yeah, I think the writers and the showrunners pretty much stepped away from, when it was done and went on to their new projects, and they're not out at conventions talking about this every other weekend. But the main cast has certainly talked about it a lot. I don't think we ever get a convention where somebody doesn't ask Jensen Ackles about, or he doesn't, for some reason, talk about the finale. I think it's happened at literally every single convention over the past 2 years, which is kind of crazy because there's only so much you can say, and he says the same thing again and again and again, but people really need to hear him say it again and again and again. So clearly there is an investment on the part of the fans of wanting to know what the actors think. I think there's been a little evolution in what Jensen, Jared, and Misha in particular say about the ending, because they are aware of the minefields that they don't really want to step in. And all of them have, from time to time, been perceived as stepping into a minefield when it comes to the last 3 episodes. So I think, and I don't like this, I think they're really careful now about what they say. And they're trying to do that same dance of, let me see if I can please faction A without alienating faction B and C. And that is a terrible tightrope to have to walk. So, I mean, I give them credit for still, I think, saying what they think, but you can tell that over time they are very aware that it's a minefield, which I think is a shame.
Yeah, it's like, well, you're not getting their real answers. Like, well, you probably are, but it's always going to be couched in some protective like language because they're not trying to piss off a third or a half or whatever of the rest of the fandom. And they
Exactly.
don't, they don't want to like nobody likes making other people mad. It's really uncomfortable.
No, I
It
mean,
sucks.
these are actually, believe it or not, fandom, three really nice people. They are all three really nice people. I've worked with all of them. They are nice, nice people. They are not out there trying to piss people off. They're out there more or less trying to make people happy. And they're in a situation where it's very hard to make all of fandom happy when you're talking about something controversial.
Controversial and just endings in general. I'll let you know when I find an ending that didn't piss someone off. It has not happened yet.
No, because I mean, look, this is, I believe this might be a line from the show, but endings are hard. Like,
Yeah.
people don't like endings. I love the finale. Did I want the finale to exist? No. I just wanted Supernatural to continue forever. So even, when I say I love the finale, it's couched in, but I didn't want there to be a finale. I'm grateful that I feel satisfied with the ending as it is, but I didn't want it. I just want more Supernatural. I will say that from the beginning, even before the ending happened, I believed that we would get more Supernatural. And I kind of knew that there was going to be the ending of the ending, the bridge scene. I kind of knew there was going to be something like that. And I was so grateful for that scene because we didn't end with the tragedy. We had this reunion at the end that was kind of joyful. And then, perhaps even more satisfying to me, I am extremely grateful that the show ended that episode by breaking the fourth wall to include the fandom in the final episode. So we're actually there. We get to hear Bob Singer call that final cut. I thought that was such a true love letter to all the fans of the show, saying, we know what a big part of this you are. We can't end this show without including you, the fandom, in the ending, and having Jared and Jensen break the fourth wall and thank us and say goodbye. That felt so healing to me, that very last, couple of minutes of the show. I thought that was a real gift.
Yeah, I don't just based on how the show evolved and developed, I don't think they could have gotten away without because they were always so directly addressing fandom without doing something like that. It would have felt empty otherwise, for sure.
Yeah, I would not have been as happy. And they could have. There's certainly plenty of shows that say, well, screw you, fans. This is what we're doing. This is our creative ending, and it's not about you, it's about the story, which it's true. But I do think you're right. For a show that has had so many explicit nods to fandom within the canon of the show and has had such a unique relationship with their fandom through all the conventions and everything else, it would have felt really wrong if they hadn't done that.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're right. If it was a different show, I'm not sure I want every show to do that. Like I don't
No,
need that from
I
every show, but
wouldn't.
because the way this show was structured and went, it wouldn't make sense otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm very grateful for that too, and that's another reason why I really love the finale.
Yeah. I So I did want to ask about, because you said like, an ending that doesn't please everyone. Do you think there will ever, like, I mean, it's the question at every convention. Do you think that there will be a revival or a reboot? Like, and do you want there to be one? Which is kind of a different question. Like, I'm not happy with the ending, so I would love for there to be a revival and like address some of the threads that I felt were dropped. But do you think that's what all fans want? Is that what you want?
It is what I want, but it's certainly not what all fans want. There's plenty of people who are really happy with the way the show went and the course of the show and the way it ended, and are nervous that if there's more of it, that it could be not a good thing and could kind of in some ways ruin the ending. And I get that. If you feel like you've had closure and you've gotten what you wanted, and you don't want to open it, potentially a can of worms, and have something happen that negates your love of that 15 years. But I personally, I love the finale, and I would love to have a revival. I would love to have a reboot. Basically because I just still really love Supernatural and I don't want it to be over. I would love them to tell more stories. I'm prepared to take on the risk that it might go somewhere that I don't want it to go, because frankly, over the course of those 15 years, there were plenty of times the show went somewhere that I didn't want it to go. I mean, this is part of being a fan, and it makes me feel old because, you know, I was a fan at the time when fans didn't even think about the fact that they might be able to somehow influence the narrative. And I don't really think about that. I just want them to tell me a story. I know I'm not going to like all of it, but I know I'm going to love some of it. And so I'm willing to take the risk in order to have more of the story and the characters that I'm still really attached to.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, like I said, I appreciate the hard work that went into the ending. I have some dangling threads that really bother me in the back of my brain. And fan fiction does a pretty good job of scratching some of those itches, but
Yeah.
I would love to see more. And I would love to see more, especially now that there has been, like, let's just say they announced it tomorrow, like that there has been a hiatus and that there has been a mixture of like a resurgence and interest of people like me who watched, on Netflix in a binge, but also maybe some cooling of some of the more intensity. I mean, I hope. I don't, I wasn't there in the early days. I feel like they could probably do some really interesting stories now.
Yeah.
Like I
Yeah.
like
No,
the
they could.
idea, yeah, like I've heard like theories that like, oh, the Chuck one theory and that he's actually still pulling the strings. Like that's an interesting idea. Or, kind of going off of what the Winchesters did with still causing trouble even dead. Like that's kind of an interesting idea. Like
I mean, that seems like it would be true. I find it
yeah.
hard to believe that Sam and Dean have just settled into heaven and la 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 la. No, they're gonna still need to do the saving people hunting things at some point.
Yeah, yeah. No, they'd be bored. Come on now.
Yeah, exactly. No, they're gonna, if they get wind of something, they're gonna want to help. It's who they are. And again, like, a controversial finale is the best thing for having more of the series, because yeah, have some dangling threads that people are gonna want to know more.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
I think it'll happen. I do think it'll happen, but it's not a guarantee because this business doesn't give you guarantees, and it depends on people's schedules lining up and finding the right, Amazon or Netflix or whatever it might be. There's a lot of moving parts that would have to come together.
yeah, it's not just the desire of the actors or the screenwriters. I mean, that's it, it's funding, it's having the set deck be put back together, it's creating a storyline that makes it feel worth like that is a lot.
Yeah.
Um, I personally think it'll happen too. I've said this before. The first Supernatural convention I attended, my first thought was, oh, this feels like a Star Trek convention in the 70s where everybody is still really into it and we're going to get another generation, but nobody knows yet. Everyone hopes, but nobody knows. That's what it
Yeah.
felt like. So I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm holding out.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And I won't be devastated and live in agony for the rest of my life if it doesn't happen, but I do think it'll happen and I do hope it'll happen.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe I'll go to San Diego Comic-Con and we'll do a big announcement. Wouldn't that be hilarious?
Dun, dun, dun.
My I know my eternal anxiety with this entire season was I'm gonna get halfway through and they're gonna announce a revival and I'm gonna be like, well, gotta scrap the season, start over. It's about endings, except for this show won't freaking end.
Endings. Oh, never mind. Just kidding. It would still be the end. It would still be the ending of Supernatural Prime. So
Yes.
you would still. I think this would still make sense.
The mothership still landed. I get
Exactly. Exactly.
it.
Exactly.
Well, so are there any last thoughts that you feel like we didn't kind of get to touch on that really stick in your head as important about the last 3 episodes?
I don't think so. The one reason for people not liking the finale that we didn't touch on is that there were some people who just really didn't like season 15 and the whole arc of what it said about religion and about God and what it did to the character of Chuck. So I think people who were really disappointed with the final season overall, it made the ending even harder to swallow because that meant there's no rectifying that disappointment, since the show was over. So
Yeah.
I think that was another group of people who had a hard time with the ending.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the direction that they chose, like, I think it's interesting to make God the big bad and, do a very
Me too.
meta story, but I can understand why that might feel like a betrayal, especially, talking to Rob. He was like, it was weird. Suddenly I was the villain and I got booed at one of the first conventions I went to at the start of the season. I was like, oh yeah, that would mess with my head.
I remember talking to him about he was like legit upset about that because
Yeah.
people had such a strong reaction and some people, not that anybody was delusional and thought that Rob was Chuck, but still, he's the one who's hearing it because he's the actor who played it and that's hard.
Yeah. I was like, oh man, that would suck.
Yeah, it
You,
did.
you get to be the funny bumbling God, and all of a sudden it's like, nope, you're the ultimate villain.
Yeah,
Well,
everybody loved Chuck. He was so lovable. Oops. I think
yeah.
that's it. I think we touched on pretty much everything else that I was thinking about.
Yeah, and I could I could go through all the nitpicky things in the last 3 episodes that I loved and the things that I hated or didn't, felt out of character to me. But I am very thankful that they were able to finish the story at all, especially just knowing how difficult it was emotionally for them to try to give the fans what they wanted. And then because it was COVID, because everything was shutting down. And the whole next episode, I'll have lots of Rob and Rich talking about that experience. But
Yeah. And I mean, I think it depends on your perspective, but I always go into media not expecting that I'm going to love everything. Like
yeah.
you don't go into a story thinking, you're not writing the story. So it's not written for you. So I always go into it expecting there's going to be some things I love and I'm going to cherish those. And there's going to be some things I really hate. And I'm just going to be like, grr, okay, well, keep going.
And
Which I
sometimes it's fun to love hating specific aspects. Like there
Sure.
is a joy in getting together with your friends and all complaining about something. I won't lie.
It's a bonding experience. It's part of group cohesion. And then, as you say, you go on the internet and find some fix it fanfic, and then you feel better and you get to read great fan fiction. So what's not to love?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been really fun conversation.
Yeah, no, it was. It was really fun. I still think that, this is this is you and I are something extraordinary in fandom. So
More cross fandom discussion. Let's do it. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation I had with Lynn Zubernis about all things supernatural. And for my husband, Daniel, if you're listening, sorry, not sorry. I wanted to thank everyone who wrote in or sent me an audio file with their thoughts on the show's conclusion. I really enjoyed hearing such a diverse array of opinions and interpretations. And I'm hoping to feature more of those responses in coming episodes. Next time on In Defense of Fandom. I don't know about you, but I have very distinct memories of the start of 2020. It was March. I was locked in my 2-bedroom apartment with my husband-to-be, desperately trying to finalize edits on my dissertation so I could finish my PhD, right as the world was locking down due to a deadly new strain of coronavirus. I thought I had it bad, but imagine what it was like trying to film the last episode of a 15-year series. Well, turns out you don't have to imagine. I spoke with a few folks who were there when it happened and remember the unique challenges of trying to wrap up a season when we couldn't be within 6 feet of each other. Editorial support was provided by Dr. Anna Funk. Music was composed and performed by Chris Scott. Cover art was designed by Liz Hand. In Defense of Fandom was made possible through an unhealthy obsession and your support via Ko-fi. Thanks especially to Meg B., Catalanta, and Tiff for supporting this season of the pod. If you're not already supporting the show and you'd like to, you can find a link in the show notes on our Ko-fi. A one-time donation of any amount will get you access to behind-the-scenes content, including the audio of some of my full conversations with this season's guests. If you can't support the show financially, giving it a review on Apple Podcast is a great way to help support this work. Your support is deeply appreciated.